Hi, and welcome to Read Review, a podcast where we talk about a variety of books from a Marxist and anarchist perspective. And I'm Corey, and I'm joined by my co-host, Justin Clark. Thanks for joining me, Justin.
Thanks for having me, Corey. It's good to see you again. It's good to be back on the show. Very excited to talk about this book tonight. It's been a crazy month. A lot of crazy things that have happened to me over the last month. But I'm doing okay. I'm hanging in there.
Good.
Live to fight another day. So to kind of set up our discussion, I wanted to talk first about the Olympics.
So
the Olympics just happened in Paris in 2024. We don't really talk about sports in this show. I'm not a sports person. The only sports I really know is pro wrestling, and people debate whether that's even a sport. So, it's certainly sports entertainment if we're going to go off that term.
Right.
But yeah, so we've recently seen, there was a gold medalist in boxing.
Yeah.
I forget her name. But she has been the torrent of a horrific campaign of libel and slander by truly awful people, including J.K. Rowling, which we'll talk about a little bit later with the book, of people who do not think that she is a cisgender woman. Not that would particularly matter,
right,
in the sense that trans athletes should be able to freely participate in sports competitions as the gender that they identify as. And there are very elaborate rules about how that's done and some of the inequities that exist there. But what I find fascinating is that this woman, who is an incredible athlete, a gold medalist, was somebody who got pilloried in public simply by virtue of her not following the traditional diktats of what was seen as a woman.
Yeah.
And so, and a lot of it had to do with one of the first fights that she had. She was fighting an Italian woman who had ties to, of course, the Italian woman that she was fighting, of course, had ties to the Italian far right. No surprise.
No surprise there.
This Italian woman that she was competing against got her shit absolutely rocked.
Yep.
Like, she got her ass beat pretty quickly, and then complained and said, "Oh, it's sore loser." Basically, I think most people who want to transvestigate athletes are sore losers, or they're supporters of sore losers. It's like, get over it. It wasn't your day. It was not your day. Just take the L and move on. But they won't, because they're cowards. They're moral cowards, and they won't do it. But it sort of caused an international storm of controversy, and I think rightfully so. That boxer is now pursuing, I think, a legal campaign against the people who denigrated her in public, including Rowling, who apparently went off Twitter for like 2 weeks and was like deleting tweets furiously, because that's, of course, exactly what your lawyers want you to do.
It's too late.
And
the internet is forever.
I thought, as I was exactly, the internet is forever. So I thought, with all of this in mind, I thought it would be a good time to talk about gender theory and talk about. Now, again, I'm going to preface this that I am a cisgendered man. I was born male, identify as male, or was born male and identify as a man. So again, my experience about this is limited, although, I do consider myself as a broader part of the sort of Q of the LGBTQ plus movement, in the sense that I'm not necessarily heterosexual, and I'm not, I'm not, but, I'm bisexual or queer, or however you want to describe that. That's kind of how I identify myself.
Okay.
So, but at the same time, I realize I have very little skin in the game compared to other people.
Right.
So just take that with what you will. Having said that, I think it's
two cis men discussing gender theory.
Gender theory, yeah. So just take that with what you will. Having said that, though, I think it's very important for people who look like us to do this kind of work.
For sure.
I think it's especially important in the age we're living now, where I think there was a time, and maybe it was, 5 to 10 years ago, more probably close to 10, where, marriage equality had happened, and it sort of felt like things were changing, and that there was sort of a not permanent progress, because progress is never permanent and determinate or determined, but it did feel like there was a certain momentum to it. And I think some of that has been stymied, and a lot of it has to do with the way that sex and gender are discussed in the broader public, and how there's like the real discussion that goes on, which is like the real discussion between, scientists, healthcare professionals, biologists, gender theorists, queer theorists, and, political leaders, activists. Like there's like the real discussion.
Yeah.
And then there's the fake discussion. And that's the one where it's like the TERFs and the bigots and those who want to ban books and those who want to ban, healthcare and want to ban any form of education about any of this.
Yeah, they're the ones picketing the drag story times.
Yeah, they're the ones who want to pass anti-drag laws or protest against drag story time and all of that.
Yeah.
And it's this fear. A lot of it's gauged as fear. And I think that all of that is kind of a fake conversation based on a fake consensus or a fake assumption or many fake assumptions.
Yeah.
And that's at the heart of the book we're going to talk about tonight. So tonight's book is Who's Afraid of Gender by Judith Butler.
Nice.
And it's a brand new book by one of the most preeminent philosophers in America working on this. Judith Butler is a philosopher. They have taught at the University of California, Berkeley for a very long time, along with the European Graduate School. They wrote a pretty path-breaking book, I think in 1990, called Gender Trouble, which is a fairly influential book within gender theory.
Okay.
And Butler has been a very, sort of path-breaking, very influential thinker. And what inspired them to write this book was that they had visited, I can't remember if it might have been Brazil. They were giving a talk somewhere in Latin America, may have been Brazil. And they got this crowd who were like, this crowd of like reactionary shitbags. They like burned an effigy of them.
Okay.
And like tried to picket Butler's talk and made the whole situation very unsafe.
Mm.
And Butler kind of rightfully so was like, well, look, I'm an academic. Like, why are people, I'm an academic, I'm an activist, I publish articles. Why am I getting all this shit? Like, who am I to get all this?
Yeah.
And that led them down a path to kind of figure out, okay, well, maybe I should interrogate that a little more and why that's the case.
Sure.
And that's pretty much what this book is. And right from the outset, this is my first book I've ever read of Judith Butler's. It's fantastic. I think it was very eye-opening for me in a lot of ways, cool. Especially in Butler's critiques of, modern politics, both in Europe, but also in the United States, and all of the different sort of modes of thinking that have limited the broader public's capacity to understand gender issues, whether it's people who are transgender, people who are sort of gender nonconforming, or non-binary, people who are in I think in the indigenous communities, they call them two-spirit. All these different terms to describe people's experiences and their lived experiences as human beings. And, right out the gate, I'm very sympathetic to this because I do feel that way. I'm going to be honest with you, probably until not about 10 years ago, did I really know much about transgender people. I almost knew nothing.
Yeah.
And what had really was eye-opening for me and what helped me learn a lot was that one of my favorite bands is Against Me. Mm-hmm. And Laura Jane Grace, the lead singer and songwriter of that band, came out as trans about 10 years ago. And there was a huge article about it in Rolling Stone. I was working at Books A Million at the time. We got the magazine in, and I was reading about it because I had absolutely loved Against Me's like record that had come out a few years before, White Crosses. And I was like, I wonder when Against Me's going to put out their new record or whatever, not knowing what was going on.
Right.
And there was this wonderful story about how she was in the process of transitioning, and then she would write a whole album about it, which I think is called Transgender Dysphoria Blues. It's a fantastic record, came out about 10 years ago. And I was like, oh, this is like a thing. Like I didn't know because of my ignorance, right?
Right.
And I've always been of the mind that people are, of course, free to live as they want. Like I'm never going to tell anybody how to live their lives.
Yeah. But
I just was ignorant. I didn't know anything about it. So it led me on a journey to kind of learn. And I've been very blessed to have had people in my life who have educated me on some of this, because either they were transgender themselves, or they were people who were kind of in the know in terms of gender.
Right.
And I was very grateful for that. And I want to say right out the gate that, and this is me echoing the sentiments when we were talking about the Citations Needed podcast before we got on the live. And this really echoes the sentiments of that show when they talk about transgender issues or LGBTQIA plus issues in general, which is that this is not a boutique issue. This is not a niche thing. Okay.
Right.
Liberation is not something that we sort of, we put on a hierarchy and say some people are more important to talk about than others simply by virtue of the fact that it's more palatable to people.
Yeah.
I don't give a shit what's more palatable to people. I don't care. I'm not going to try to do like corner cutting in my empathy for bigots.
Yeah.
And I think that's often how the discussion is around, transgender issues or gender issues broadly, is that there's this sort of, well, it's a boutique thing and it's not really important or whatever.
Right.
Negating the fact that there are millions of Americans who identify as transgender or queer or whatever.
Yeah.
And that they're working class people who, they have to navigate, American capitalism with this added level of difficulty, because
for sure
they have to deal with social stigmatization. They have to deal with the lack of healthcare. They have to deal with the lack of community resources, the lack of community in general, because oftentimes their family might, abandon them, especially if they're a part of like a particularly conservative or religious community. And, this is a part of our working class struggle. Like, queer people and transgender people are part of the working class, period.
Yeah.
And to say that they don't matter because like, oh, we should care about like some old fashioned notion of what you think the working class is, like, no, the Stonewall riots in 1969, when a bunch of cops tried to shut down the gay bar, the Stonewall Inn in New York City. Stonewall was a riot. Like, like the beginning of the gay rights movement in America was a riot. It was led by two transgender activists. One,
right.
Marsha P. Johnson, the other one's whose name escapes me at the moment. But and so that's a part of history that's very important, right?
Yeah.
And so that's kind of like the setup for what Butler's, I think, theoretical framing of this book is. But before we get into that, do we have anybody joining us? Any comments, questions? I always want to stop for that.
Velkin999 said, hey.
Hello.
And apparently President Donald John Trump never lost a match to a woman.
I never lost a match to a woman.
I don't think it's that big a deal if you did, and I don't believe you.
Yeah, it wouldn't really matter. I mean, if we're going on popular vote, you didn't.
Right. Yeah.
And Biden did beat you in 2020, which and his vice president is Kamala Harris. So you kind of were beaten by a woman. I mean, that kind of counts. Not to mention the fact that weren't you married 3 times? I think maybe you don't have the most healthy relationship with women to begin with.
Yeah.
And Stormy Daniels certainly kicked your ass in court. So there's that too.
That's right.
But yeah. Oh boy. At least they use one of the pictures of him smiling. I always hate his like scowl. He just always looks like he's holding in a fart. Anyway.
Yeah.
So
I guess I was just going to say like, yeah, I would say I didn't know much about trans people about 10 years ago either. And I think it was 2015. I interviewed Marissa Alexa McCool for my old podcast years ago. And I don't know, there was a thing where I really felt an affinity for the struggle that trans people were facing at that point. And I still feel that. I feel like this is a very important issue. I know that in terms of percentages, it's not a huge percentage of the population that are going through this, but that, like you said, that still translates into millions of individuals that are experiencing the oppression of not being able to express their gender the way they feel. They are not, often they're being discriminated against in a variety of ways, and including having trouble getting housing, including having trouble getting jobs. I don't know. I'm not trans, but I've always felt very, like I say, an affinity for the struggle that trans people are facing.
Yeah, me too. And I think a lot of it has to go with that sense of solidarity that we understand. Once you read and learn about the plight of people who have to experience the sort of social ostracization and economic limitations that people often face. A lot of times a lot of people who are homeless, or people who experience domestic violence or forms of sexual violence, are often people who are trans, right?
Yeah.
Because a lot of times, they often, because the traditional economy spurns them, they often go into different lines of work or whatever. And that's not to say that that's the majority, but yeah, I think it's when you live under this system and you experience challenges yourself, ones that kind of make you challenge your own identity, right? I had to come to terms with that myself. I went through that kind of journey myself about 10 years ago, where I realized that I'm not straight, I'm not, right. And I kind of had to, and even though I'm with a woman, I'm married to a woman happily, but I'm not traditionally heterosexual, right. I'm just not. And sort of, well, what does that mean for me? And I think that when it comes to people and their lived experience and what they're trying to gain is just acceptance and equality and tolerance, which is I think we wouldn't ask that of we wouldn't challenge we wouldn't challenge women traditionally on that, although although that's certainly the case. We wouldn't necessarily hold to the same kind of outmoded notions about African Americans or or any other minority. And so it seems to me when I learned about all this stuff, it was a no-brainer. It was just of course, Yeah. And anyway, so that really gets us to the heart of Butler's book, which is that there's, as I mentioned earlier, there's the real conversation about gender and sexuality. And then there's the fake conversation, or what she calls the phantasm. Mm-hmm. And it's kind of it's basically a specter. It's fake. It's not real. It's this sort of, these people have, you could call it it's like a panic in a sense.
Right.
And
like a moral panic of a kind.
It's a moral panic, yeah. But it's a moral panic that's kind of rooted. It's rooted in misconceptions, and because it's based on misconceptions, it reaches conclusions that no one else would, based on the if they had correct information. And so, what we've seen around the world in terms of the discrimination or violence or bigotry that has been pushed against people of the LGBTQIA+ community, a lot of times it comes out of some of it's just genuine misunderstanding and ignorance, people who don't know better. that could be educated and could learn. And I still believe most people are basically good. I think if you could teach people, most people, I think they would be amenable to learning. And even if they weren't necessarily like, yay, gung ho, like I think most people are tolerant and respectful of others and their right to be themselves. But we live in a world now where you have all of these different kind of trends and strands that are kind of all going together to create this sort of worst case scenario of panic and violence and discrimination.
Yeah.
So she devotes a chapter to the Vatican and the Catholic Church in general, which I just want to preface that, like, the Catholic Church has no fucking grounding to stand on about what counts as a moral issue or not.
Yeah, no, that's right.
Like, I mean, I think that the Catholic Church has been discredited decades, if not centuries ago. Like, no one should ever pay attention to what the Catholic Church has to say, or what the Pope has to say. And specifically about Pope Francis, which, you know, Pope Francis often gets sort of paraded around as if he's like this like progressive guy or whatever. And I guess in some ways, compared to his absolutely draconian predecessors, including one who was part of the Hitler Youth, then yeah, I guess compared to his predecessors, yeah, he does look a little better by comparison. But that ain't saying much.
No.
That's like saying Joe Biden is better than Donald Trump. Again, not much.
Yeah.
But one of the things that that the Vatican's very serious about is that they are very much against what they call gender ideology. And they think of gender ideology as being something that's sort of pushed on others or it's forced on other people.
As soon as you start using a term like gender ideology, I know you're full of shit. Like,
absolutely, right? Which is funny because, like, what's interesting about people who use terms like gender ideology or genderism or whatever, like again, it's the phantasm that Butler talks about. Yeah. It's this fake panic that's based on nonsense, or misinformation or just full on bigotry. Often they have an agenda. They have an ideology that they're trying to push.
Yeah.
So the Vatican has this sort of doctrine of what they call complementarity, which is that, you know, men and women complement each other and they serve different roles, and that's the way God made them or whatever. And so this is why the Vatican, among many other reasons, is against transgender rights. Now, like I think people have asked him, like, can transgender people go to heaven? And I think he said like yes or whatever. But again, like, first off, there's no guarantee that heaven is real.
Right.
So that's like saying, you know, that, do you know, like, do trans people get into, like, you know, do they get to go to like Valhalla, or do they get to go to, like, you know, that they get to go to the Shire? Like, what are you talking about?
Yeah,
right?
That's right.
It's like a fiction. First off, it's a fiction. Or at the very least, it's something that can't be proved.
My apologies to anybody who believes in heaven, but
but come on, it's a fiction, right? Or at the very least, if it's not a fiction, it's a deeply held belief by somebody that, like, that cannot be positively proven,
right,
in reality, right? It's something you take on faith, and that's fine. Like, that's totally fine. That's cool. That's fine with me. What I'm saying is that when he says something like that, that's like the equivalent of like a Southern woman saying, "You bless your heart." Like, you know, she's being a patronizing asshole when she's saying that to you. Yeah. And she doesn't actually care about you. It's just a way of like trying to look nice when in reality they could give a shit. And I think that's what it is with Pope Francis. I think it's a lot of smoke and mirrors and patronizing, while at the same time, you know, he has been very clear about being against people actively pursuing the gender that they wish. That's wrong.
I have a serious issue. Like, if you think that trans people can go to heaven, like, what is the criteria by which trans people are allowed to go to heaven?
Right.
Are they allowed to go to heaven but not have rights on earth? Like, what exactly are you trying to say here? It doesn't make any sense to me.
Well, and the other thing too, where it's like, where, you know, I mean, there was a speech, she talks about it in the book, or they talk about it in the book, where Butler mentions that Pope Francis gives a speech where he, like, compares, you know, essentially compares gender ideology in their mind to, or in his mind, to Nazism and nuclear war. Like, basically saying, like, these are like these, like, this gender ideology that's taking over the world. And again, like pre-transgender rights being a main part of that discussion. Before that, it was just, like women wanting to work and like, rights to reproductive freedom and autonomy and not being stuck in marriages where they're being abused. Or like sexual freedom. And, people who, people who were gay or lesbians who wanted to be with someone of the same gender. The Vatican was against all that shit too.
Before that, it was miscegenation, and
before that was miscegenation. Before
they're just
that,
against the next thing that makes
before that it was like marrying. It was like a Catholic marrying a Protestant or a Jew.
That's right.
It's like it's the same thing, right? It's don't mix different kinds or whatever.
Yeah.
And so what's really frustrating is that this like complementarity thing. First off, again, it's kind of just sort of a moral fiction. It's just like this belief system that the Catholic Church has. It isn't really based in anything because, gender roles a lot of times they're learned. They're not born in, right? So, So for example, like in prehistorical societies, I think we talked a little bit of this when we talked about David Graeber and stuff, but like, there were matriarchal societies where women were sort of the leaders and the men complemented them, right? Where the women were like, there's more evidence coming out that women were also hunter-gatherers as much as men were.
Yep.
And sometimes men would stay home and the women would go out and vice versa, right? Like we're learning more and more all the time that these gender roles as established in sort of the West, because this is what we're talking about too, right? Like we're talking about the Vatican, we're talking about what we think of as broadly the West or like the European world.
Established in the Middle Ages type thing.
Yeah, exactly. That, these are these traditional gender roles, despite the fact that like, there's throughout history, people who have challenged those gender roles all the time. And that, some men are better at some things that are traditionally seen as female and vice versa. I think the problem with the Catholic Church's view of all this is it's a very sad limitation of what humanity is capable of.
Yeah.
Humanity is deeply capable of all kinds of things. I mean, I just think, for example, that these very few interventions that can be done on a social and medical level for someone to transition from being a female to a male or vice versa, the fact that it doesn't take all that much to do it,
right,
kind of shows you kind of how malleable the human being is. Like, I've loved seeing like those videos where it's like this really life affirming thing where it's like, someone's like, this is who I used to be. And I was at my lowest and I didn't feel comfortable in my own skin, and they get to be themselves. And a lot of times it's either they've come out, and they're happily with their partner, or they're trans and they're sort of showing their transition in real time. And it's this kind of beautiful thing. And I'm like, do you see how easy this is? Like, it's not that hard.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like, and so it just goes to show you that a human being is extremely malleable.
Yeah.
And that's a good thing. That kind of shows our diversity. Exactly. Not to mention the fact that, just leaving the trans conversation aside, there are intersex people.
Yep.
Who are genetically both sort of and anatomically like both male and female at the same time.
Yeah.
And there was no medical intervention in that. They're just like that. And there are millions of people like that. And so, so what does the Catholic Church has to say about intersex people? Nothing, because it's, again, complementary. Like, the fact that intersex people exist spits in the face of like what this complementarity nonsense is.
Right.
But what we've seen time and time again, and I love the fact that keep misgendering them. Butler does a fantastic job of doing what I think we try to do on this show, which is we're going to criticize religion. Corey and I are both atheists. Like, we're going to criticize religion, but we are never going to do that punching down.
Right.
We're always going to do that punching up. And that's what Butler does in this book. Butler never like punches down at people because they believe in religion.
Mm-hmm.
And in many ways, later parts of the book where they talk about like people who are two-spirit and different indigenous perspectives and global perspectives of gender and spirituality, it's a very well-rounded, respectful dialogue about that. Not to mention the fact that there are many, many people, including Christians, who are LGBTQIA+, or, you know what I mean? So that's never the issue. The issue is religious institutions and elites forcing a worldview onto others using power and money.
Yeah.
That's the real problem. And it's not just the Vatican. It's also, extreme evangelical communities in America. So Butler in another chapter discusses the horrific anti-gay laws in Uganda that people have discussed over the years. So much so, even about 10 years ago, even the U.S. State Department got involved in it. And one of the things you'll often hear is like, oh, well, it's Africa, they're backward or whatever, this kind of like racist colonial shit they'll often hear.
Yeah.
When in reality, like a lot of times these extremely bigoted views they're transplanted. They're not something that's indigenous to the community or the country itself. It's something that's sort of pushed through by outsiders kind of pushing an ideology and then sort of using the phantasm of gender to confuse people and to muddy the waters against equality. And that's what we see in places all over the world, but especially in Uganda. In Eastern Europe, it's the same thing, where you have these radical evangelical Christians in America who have extremely bigoted views about LGBTQIA+ people will go to Africa and say their horrific shit and get people on board. A lot of times because they come with money.
Yep.
They come with money and sort of a certain level of prestige, I guess.
A lot of those countries in Africa were turned into Catholic or what have you because of colonization. And so then they ended up abandoning a lot of their previous beliefs, or they get shuffled off to the side, the edges of society. And then we send evangelical ministers go over from North America with all this money, and they spread their hate. They have like pamphlets talking about how LGBTQ stuff is against God, and like this is all the devil's work and stuff, and like stuff that like if you're like a secular person seems like insane, but if you've been raised in a culture of colonized Catholicism, then it rings true to you. And it's one of the things, like I think it was, I can't remember which country it was, but relatively recently there was a discussion in one of the parliaments in an African country. Forgive me, I cannot remember which one. But they were talking about how LGBTQ plus ideology was colonization. When literally it's the hatred of LGBTQ plus people that is due to colonization. Like it's just everything's upside down. Everything's backwards.
That is exactly right. And Butler makes that exact point.
Okay.
Which is exactly right, where people will often use this sort of their anti-LGBTQ plus folks, their bigotry, and they'll say, oh, well, they're trying to push, this is an outside thing that's trying to be pushed on you by these, these uppity white people. Like, you know what I mean? Like they're pushing on you, these Westerners with their crazy ways or whatever. When in reality, like you said, it's either Catholics or hardcore American evangelical Protestants coming over to these countries with a lot of money and like a lot of swagger and sort of pushing their own ideology. I mean, what I find interesting is how, anti-gender or like anti-gender ideology, being anti-gender is an ideology in and of itself.
Yeah. Because
you're not actively interrogating gender scholars or scholars of critical race theory. For example, in the book, Butler notes one of the big anti-education, basically anti-public school advocates in America, who's like this hard right evangelical, where that person was asked, like, have you actually interrogated any of this? Have you read like Kimberly Crenshaw? Have you read Judith Butler? And he's like, no, I don't read that shit.
Yeah. Why would he need to read that? He's against it.
It's so fascinating to me because, like, again, it's like, so you're not interested in interrogating the work of these supposed ideologies which you hate so much, but yet you're not willing to actively like learn what they actually represent, and you're not interested at all in having an honest and open discussion and free inquiry.
Yeah.
And that's another component of the book that I loved is Butler does throughout the book this incredible full-throated defense of real free speech, real academic freedom, and real freedom of expression and thought and discussion. That we're living in an era now where a lot of times the people who are like the free speech people or the I'm just trying to start a conversation people are actually trying to shut down conversations because they don't like the implications of what those conversations would actually entail, which is that we know that sex is on a spectrum. Because there are intersex people, right?
That's right?
We know that gender is on a spectrum. You know that gender is as much a part of culture as it is a part of the biological world. What Butler calls co-construction, which is true.
Yeah.
You know that we're not denying that we're biological creatures. We're not denying the fact. But what we're criticizing are these staid notions of something like sexual dimorphism, which again, like humans, like you'll hear that a lot. It's something Richard Dawkins talks about a lot. Well, we're sexually dimorphic. Like, I guess in a broad brush we are, but again, that negates intersex people. It negates people who identify as gender nonconforming or non-binary or people who are transitioning, right? Or people who are trans from male to female, female to male, or whatever. It denies all of that and says, oh, we're just this. That's it. And it's like, well, no, it's actually a lot more complicated than that. And the more that we learn about this, the more that we know that it's more complicated than that. And not to mention the fact that it is really, it's really an intermingling of, the human experience, the environment, and genetics, and how all those play a key role. We talked about this way back with the Daniel Dennett episode when we talked about gene culture coevolution, that cultural trends are sort of an amalgam of both biological factors and social and cultural factors that kind of go hand in hand in a related way, as Marx would call it, a dialectical way, and that leads towards a much more complicated notion of what certain things mean. And I think that's true. I think that, and in general, what we're seeing in the United States, whether it's, banning certain books from libraries or banning of sex education, which I think disastrous. As somebody who grew up in the rural Midwest who got absolutely no sex education in high school, I can tell you, like, I would not recommend. That's not great. And so they don't want to have frank discussions of sex any more than they want to have frank discussions of race, because if they did, then they would have to reckon with the legacies of slavery and indentured servitude. They'd have to reckon with the legacies of Jim Crow and bigotry on that level, not to mention the fact that in America, voting rights for women pretty much weren't codified until the 1920s. And that, again, was only really white women.
Yeah.
And then today we're seeing more voting rights challenges where voting rights are being stripped away and as opposed to democracy. So I think it's all an effort to not get people to think. I think, and I think one of the things that Butler talks about too is that there's this fear that, and again, this is part of the phantasm of gender or gender ideology or whatever.
Yeah.
Is there's this fear that somehow if we teach kids about gay people or we teach kids about trans people, that they will be gay or trans.
Right. Which is like, it's the ignorance that's saving us, right?
Like it's like, and just the fact that we live in the world we live in, where discussions of sex, gender, and race are very limited in a lot of respects in mainstream political discourse or mainstream social and cultural discourse. And the fact that there are still there are millions of people who are gay, millions of people who are trans, openly, goes to show you that whole idea is bullshit. Like it's all nonsense. Or it's very much, and again, I'm not saying they're apples to apples at all, but it's something to think about, which is the way in which we talk about autism. And again, I'm not equating the two, but what I'm saying is that notions of autism were severely limited. We didn't really know what autism was. Autism was often called childhood schizophrenia for many, many years. And the reason why more and more people are autistic is because we know more and more about it. We know more and more about it. We know how to diagnose it and so on. Yeah. It's the same thing with people who are gay or trans or any broad part of that LGBTQIA plus community. Is as knowledge does grow and as social acceptance becomes even bigger, then more and more people will feel comfortable being who they really are, being their true selves, right? Yeah. And so, in a sense, like if people do learn, will more people come out as gay or trans? Yeah, probably. I mean, that's probably true. It's not like every person's going to be like that. That'd be absurd. Like, that's kind of like saying that if the more people learn about dogs, then everybody would want to be a dog. Like, it's kind of stupid. Like, or everybody who learns about basketball players means that they all want to be basketball players. Wow. Like, or they're going to be basketball players. It's like very, very odd.
Yeah. It's like the sense of gender is, it's so freeing, perhaps so persuasive that if we even know about it at all, we'll all want to transition because
I mean, it's so odd. I mean, it's
very
so
strange.
It's very, very strange. It's weird. Yeah. And I think a lot of it is the conservative anxieties that we see in America, especially, where you have the gutting of public education, you have the gutting of gender studies programs or Africana studies programs or whatever. It's all a way of shutting down real discussion. And so the people who are calling for a real discussion on race and gender are the ones who are actually shutting down the real discussion on race and gender, because they know that if we actually had that discussion, they'd lose. Yeah. They'd be wrong. Yeah. And they don't like that because, deep down, I think they know what they're doing. That's the other thing, too, is that people who are anti-trans or anti-LGBTQI plus in general, they know what they're doing. Yep. They will hem and haw and they'll try to equivocate and they'll try to be like, they'll do a tiptoe and they'll do a song and dance where it's like, well, I hate the sin, love the sinner kind of shit, which is essentially J.K. Rowling's position.
That's why they started with the concern about the women's bathrooms, and then they switched over to women in sports, and then they switched over because they know they're full of shit, so they can't stay in one place because as soon as we debunk it, as soon as it becomes shown to be false, they have to move on to another one.
Yeah, they keep moving the goalpost, which itself is an illogical fallacy, like constantly moving the goalpost, right? So Butler does have a discussion of this in the book about athletes, trans athletes, or just athletes in general. So there was, I believe there was a athlete, she may have been a runner or a sprinter. I can't remember exactly what, but she was someone who was a cisgender woman, but she had high testosterone levels. And that was just who she was. Like, that's just genetic. Like, that's who she was. Yeah. And what we often see is that much like gender, like hormones are often on a spectrum. So like sometimes women who are cisgender, they were born female, have higher testosterone than other people who were born male. Yep. And that changes. And one of the things is that the sort of the international athletic communities, especially the International Olympic Committee, the IOC, like they have rules about this kind of stuff. So if you have like too high levels of testosterone, you have to take like certain medications so that you're basically a part of the average, right? Which again, as Butler has noted in the book, like this can be harmful to people's health, like very harmful to people's health to make them fit this supposed standard that you've made them fit, which is kind of absurd.
Yeah, it's nonsense and arbitrary. We want our athletes to be superior, but not too superior. We want to feel like they're not cheating because by how superior they are.
It reminds me of one of Kurt Vonnegut's classic stories, Harrison Bergeron, which is a society where everyone is equal, and the way that he makes people, so if you're like really beautiful, they make you wear a mask, or if like you're really tall, they make you slouch, or they give you stilts to make you taller, and they do this kind of stuff. To me, it feels like a version of that, where we're doing all of this horrific shit and this weird like medical experimentation on people in terms of making them fit certain rules that were sort of arbitrarily laid out anyway, that could harm their health in the long term, not to mention their own mental and physical, like their own mental health too. Because like, again, it's the mental toll this takes on people to be like, to do all this. So it just seems all bullshit.
Yeah, it's a little bit funny, I think, because they often characterize our visions of a world with equality in that way, right? Like they believe that we want to cut everybody who's tall off at the knees so that they fit the average. And and it's more like we want everybody to be where they are and be accepted as that. And they're like, no, that person's too strong. No, that person's too tall. That person's not fitting my idea of gender.
Oh, exactly. And a real notion of equality or equity, however you want to call it, like a real notion of equality is that people are free to be the best versions of themselves. That's what should be the most important thing. So for example, I'm 6'3". I'm a tall guy. I'm also kind of a big guy. A lot of times because of my size, people thought that I was a football player. I only played football up to 7th grade, thank God, because I can't imagine what it would have been like to my brain if I had continued to do it. Yeah. If anybody wants to know what's really fucking dangerous to kids, okay, here's I'm going to lay this out for you so that the simpletons can understand. You know what's really harmful to kids? It's not health. It's not, gender-affirming healthcare. You know what's really harmful to kids? Football and school shooters. Those people are really dangerous to kids, especially football. Football's fucking dangerous.
The thing that America basically worships.
Yeah. It's like a religion. I would say in this country, even though people will protest this, I think the hierarchy of gods in this country is money, football, and then Jesus.
Yeah.
Like money is definitely number one. This country worships money. Don't let anybody ever tell you any different. This country does not worship Jesus. It worships money. Second, they worship football. And then at a very far third is Jesus. And so football is really, really dangerous. It's very dangerous to developmental health, not just for the brain, because it's extremely dangerous to the brain, but also it's also just dangerous. Like you could get broken bones, you could have spine injuries, you could have all kinds of stuff, could leave you paralyzed, whatever. Cheerleading is super dangerous, which people don't realize. Because cheerleading, at least with football, it's somewhat regulated. Cheerleading isn't, because it's not technically known as a sport. Yeah. So and so, like football is very, very dangerous. I mean, I hope that, hopefully humanity will get its shit together and we won't die either of climate change or nuclear hell. But like, my hope is that in the future, like 100 years from now, in the utopia that I wish for all of us, that people will look back at football kind of like how we looked at like the Romans doing like the jousting gladiator fights with lions and shit. Like we will look at it as being this like deeply barbaric thing that we shouldn't have been doing. Yeah. And like smoking and football. But anyway, I think that when it comes to, I know we're getting towards the hour, so I wanted to talk about a couple other things. One,
Velkin's had some good comments throughout.
Let's hear some comments by all means.
So near the start, Velkin 999 said, "I didn't know Jack 10 years ago. It was mind blowing to have it explained to me that gender and sex are two very different things."
I know, right? Yeah. I agree. Like I didn't really get that understanding either until I really learned about it. And then once you learn it, it's one of those things where it kind of blows your mind, and then you're kind of like, oh, well, of course, like that makes sense.
Yeah. Why did I not know that before?
That's so obvious. Yeah.
Yeah. And then Velkin 999 expressed some surprise that Valhalla is not real.
Hey, man, if it's real to you, that's fine. I'm just saying, like, it's debatable.
Yeah. Yeah. We got also traditional gender roles ruined a good chunk of paleontology.
Oh, for sure. I mean, this is the part of the problem of like, this is the problem I have with people who are like, accept facts. Well, it's like facts don't exist in a vacuum. Like facts are often developed in the contexts in which they come in which they come about. Like,
Yeah.
for example, like when it comes to paleontology or the anthropology, like you have a lot of probably, cis white dudes from affluent backgrounds coming in, right? So they're coming in with their own preconceived notions of what a woman might do or a man might do instead of having a more open mind. I think David Graeber and David Wengrow in their book, The Dawn of Everything, which we've covered on the show, talks a little bit about this, about how it took time for those paradigms to be challenged. And they still have to be challenged. But you're right. Yeah. I think it hampers education.
And then also, I doubt they've read a Bible. Why would they read Judith Butler's book?
Yeah, that's a good point.
They don't read at all. So.
Yeah. It's so interesting to worship a book. Like,
it's very
you know what I mean? Like, I don't think any book is particularly worth worship. Like, there's certain books that are really good, ones that you have a certain affinity for or reverence for, but like to worship a book, especially when you haven't read, it's a good point. It's a really good point.
And more recently, they said, I taught my kids about dinosaurs, and now they're sprouting T-Rex arms.
Exactly. Right? Like, exactly. And I think for many people, their experience of learning this stuff is eye-opening, and gets them to think a little bit about themselves. But fundamentally, there are a lot of folks who were born male and still identify as male. Like, that's me. Like, I learned about all this stuff, and I'm still a dude, right? I very much feel like a man.
Yep. Didn't transition,
and that's fine, and I think that's the other thing too, is that it's like people think that by trans people existing, it somehow denigrates or harms cisgender people. Right. It's like, that's not true.
That's your Elon Musk's going along with pretending that cis is a slur.
Right. And it's not, I think the other thing too is that there's this real reluctance, I think, because there are a lot of people who are so afraid that if they accept this, then like their whole sort of view of the world falls apart. And it's like, no, when you learn things, you let go of other things that are wrong, and then you sort of go forward, and it expands your view of the world.
Yeah.
Most of what you learn doesn't contract the world that you see.
Yeah, that's right.
Right? And if you're living in a world where the goal is to contract what people can see rather than to expand it, then I would think deeply about what you're actually doing.
Yeah.
Because it's not, your goal is not education.
Yeah, it's like a mission to make the world a worse place. Like, what are you doing, actually?
Yeah. Or it's like the goal to make an already selfish people more selfish. It's like, but that's libertarianism, right? Like libertarianism.
Yeah, true.
We're true libertarians here on the podcast.
That's right.
Of the left, the libertaire, the French tradition, they stole our term.
Yeah, that's right.
But,
and one last one. Regarding the sports stuff, it also comes from a misunderstanding of hormones. Hormones have highs and lows and don't influence your body nearly as much as people think. High testosterone doesn't necessarily mean more muscle.
Exactly. And also, I find that, and this is a point that Butler makes in the book too, I find that the discussion of not just trans athletes, but also just the way that these people talk about, like, say, gender-affirming care or whatever, it borderlines on, like, it reminds me very much of, like, the eugenics shit, where it's this extreme scientism, right?
Yeah.
And what I mean by that. So, scientism is the belief that science is the answer to any and all questions about human existence or existence in general, that everything that we can learn is actually through science and nothing else, which is bullshit.
And it's pure and unbiased and has nothing wrong about it ever.
Right. And that goes in with positivism, and positivism is another form of this, right? Where the only things that matter are facts, which are objectively defined by scientific method, all this kind of shit.
Yeah.
When in reality, science is it's a deeply complicated subject, and it's a very discursive enterprise where you're talking. It's a conversation, not necessarily a lecture. Science itself is extremely messy. There's certain universal things that we all know because of science. The fact that the Earth is 4.8 billion years old, the fact the universe is 13.8 billion years old, that the dinosaurs died out 65 billion years ago, that there are intersex people, as well as there are people who are cis male or cis female, and that sex and gender are often not exactly this. They aren't exactly the same thing, and that those two things are deeply discursive terms in and of themselves. They require an incredible amount of deliberation. Like the anti-gender folks don't want to get into that conversation because they want to just do this hard science shit, like this weird, like biological determinism shit. The other thing that's always drove me nuts about like the trans athletes and sports thing, and is that sports are a lot about sports, and competitions in general is decided by luck. So, like you could be having a bad day, and you don't get first, or you don't even place, right? You could be the best athlete, the most perfectly tuned athlete. Your hormone levels are supposedly at the right amount, and your muscle fibers are exactly the way they should be, and blah 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 blah, and you still don't place. Yeah, because that's luck.
Years and years ago, I was really into sports betting, and I tracked the NFL intensively. Like I had multiple hours of just riding in a truck while we were going to jobs while I was working. So I would track what was going on with teams, and I would write it down. And I had what I thought was a very good formula for how to figure out who would win and who would lose. And I was still only like 50% right.
I know, right?
Like there's so much that goes on in games. It has maybe a little bit to do with, hormones.
Right? Yeah. I mean, it's like a level of a certain amount of hormone in one's body, like can't really necessarily denote all of human experience. It's like, so like some men have like at any given time, maybe more estrogen in their body than they do women. Yeah. Or they do testosterone, right? Or vice versa. Like and so it seems to me like I find that, especially with that athlete who was a cis woman who had high testosterone levels, she was also a Black woman. So again, take into that all you will,
Pastor
right?
Sermania?
I think Sermania, yeah. And so take in all like the legacy of like slavery and the legacy of like imperialism, colonialism, take all of that in, right? So it's deeply like from the get, like they're singling out her, and it's like, okay, would you have done that to a white athlete? Right. Yeah. I doubt it. Would you have done it to a male athlete, like someone who was cis male? I doubt it. Yeah. Right. And so I think that's the part that I find very frustrating, is it's this like biological determinism, which sort of reifies bigotry and reifies outmoded stereotypes. I just don't think I think it's very weird to make people have to do certain medicinal procedures that they don't have to do and don't necessarily want to do, to make them fit into some existing paradigm that works for everybody, because you're so afraid that like, trans people are cheating. That's something you hear this like, oh, it's cheating. Well, it's like, it's not cheating. Like, I don't understand what you mean by that. It's like absurd. Yeah. And so the other thing too, and as Butler, I think, points out in the book, like, sometimes the trans athletes don't do much better anyway. It's because, again, it's up to chance. Like
more often than not, actually.
More often than not, they do just about as well as anybody else, which goes to show you, like, one, the human being is pretty incredible and how malleable we are, but also two, that like there's so many different things to account for in life, and sometimes you're not going to have, today is not your day, right? And some days you're going to have the best day in the world and everything's going to go right for you. And other days you're going to be in the shit the whole day. And that's just life. Like, and so I think that's the other thing too, is that the anti-LGBTQ people, I think they are so afraid of the world being a little more complicated than they know, that they're like, well, we can't have this, we can't, they don't want you to see it, They're very much like the Wizard of Oz. It's like, don't pay attention to the man behind the curtain. It's like, they don't want you to see it, because then you would start asking those questions.
If I pretend the world isn't complicated, then it isn't.
Yes. Yeah. And this has a real world impact, right? Where, there are people who, there are people who experience violence, sexual violence.
Yeah, that's right.
There are people who experience economic hardship. There are people who experience discrimination. There are people who experience, just the casual microaggressions of being misgendered. I even did in this episode, I accidentally misgendered Butler myself, and I feel terrible about it, right? It's hard. These are hard things to unlearn for people who, have thought of how language is limiting. Butler has a whole chapter in the book on how languages, especially English, limit the discussion of gender, because English doesn't always have the correct terminology for things. The fact that we have things that are heavily gendered, or in other Romance languages like Spanish or French, where you have male words and female words.
Yeah, like you've gendered like every noun in
yes.
French, right?
And that, again, limits our capacity for expanding our notions of what gender is. Yeah. So built even into the language itself, built into our languages, which, again, are products of imperialism. You and I both speak English because our countries were products of the British Empire.
Yeah.
And it's the same with people in, Africa who speak French.
Yep.
They're products of an empire. And so those are ways in which our capacities for understanding ourselves and the spectrum of who we could be are severely limited by language itself, which is very true. And I don't think that's particularly controversial.
Not among people who actually are interested.
Right.
Yeah.
And so, I think this has real world implications. I really do. I think that we live in a time where we are seeing more and more just straight up bigotry against LGBTQ people. We are seeing in the United States far right Republican candidates for elected office using the F slur in ads.
Yeah.
And I think that's egregious. I don't even think that would have been something that you would have heard maybe 5 or 10 years ago, let alone now.
Like in the 90s, it was okay. But then in the 2010s, it all just kind of looked, everybody realized that was a bullshit thing to do, right?
Exactly. And, and I think that has real grave implications for where we go forward. But what we do on the left is we have to maintain hope in spite of everything being not so great.
Yeah.
I think maintaining that sense of hope is very important. And Butler really ends the book with that, is that in a lot of ways, if we continue the fight to push forward for LGBTQ plus rights, that we stand up against misinformation, that we actually stand for real open inquiry of ideas and not the supposed, the Dave Rubin version of it where we listen to right-wing people and nobody else.
Yeah.
And that we actually interrogate why we might have those bigotries in the first place. I want to end kind of bringing it full circle and talk a little bit about J.K. Rowling and sort of the British phenomenon of TERFs. So, you have trans exclusionary radical feminists. That's what TERF stands for, or radical feminists. I don't like them being called radical feminists because they're not. They are not radical. They're conservative feminists. They're reactionary feminists. It's probably a better word for them is reactionary feminists.
Yeah.
But they call themselves gender critical. This is another term you'll often hear. And Butler has a good chapter in the book about some of this stuff, especially in Britain, because transphobia in Britain is uniquely pervasive and horrific, and especially about Rowling. The thing about J.K. Rowling that I didn't know, and it I think helps me understand, not necessarily I don't agree with her, but I understand like, oh, okay, So when she was younger, J.K. Rowling was in a horrific abusive relationship with a man.
Right.
She is the survivor of domestic violence. And my heart does go out to her for that. That's a horrific thing. That's something no one should ever have to experience.
Yep.
And so, but unfortunately, instead of those horrific experiences happening to her, broadening her sense of empathy, it's actually limited it because she has this weird notion in her head. Again, very much the phantasm of gender that we've been discussing tonight from Butler's book.
Yeah.
That somehow, trans women aren't really women. They're actually still men, and that they're going to just commit violence and horrific actions against other women, that we're letting men into spaces that were traditionally women.
Yeah.
First off, trans women are women, period.
Yep.
It doesn't matter how much they've transitioned or if they transition at all. I don't give a shit. Trans women are women. If you're so afraid of someone who doesn't look quite like you or doesn't quite fit into what you think what a woman looks like coming to the bathroom with you, that's a you problem.
Yeah.
That is a you problem. Sorry, it is. Because trans people, on the whole, don't commit violence against people. They just don't.
Yeah.
And if they do, it's not any better or worse than the other parts of the population, but they don't, right? Because they're a small fraction of society. More likely than not, the people who are going to hurt you are men. Yeah. The people who are going to hurt you are men, not trans women, men. Okay. They're, why are you taking your horrific experience of being abused by a man to make it about being afraid about trans women?
Yeah. Extending that man's actions into the area of women that are, it's just wrong. It
is
bad thinking.
And it's really bad thinking. And it's also just deeply, morally bankrupt. I think that it does not really interrogate why violence happens to women at all. Not to mention the fact that there is also, I think very important to note that there's also violence against men, right?
Yep.
There's sexual violence against men.
Yep.
And that happens too. And what I find fascinating, especially about TERFs, is they often, or just in general, the whole discussion of trans people, is they don't get hung up on trans men. They really don't. They really don't. Maybe the only time they do is if one's a bodybuilder or something and is competing in the Olympics or some shit. But in general, you almost always hear about trans women.
Yeah.
And it's so again, it's this, weirdly enough, in Rowling's attempt and in the TERF's attempt to try to be pro-woman, they end up actually kind of reaffirming misogyny.
Yeah, and patriarchy,
and their patriarchy by their anti-trans perspective.
Yep.
And that I find fascinating because it's true. They're ultimately making a place that is less safe for women, period. It's whether they're trans or not.
Yeah, they say they call themselves gender critical, but they're gender essentialists, right? They believe that gender is sex. And what is sex? It's body parts. It's mechanical. It has nothing to do with the way a person expresses themselves. It's a person with a uterus is considered a woman. But not all women have uteruses. Not all women can give birth. You're being a gender essentialist, and in doing that, you're discriminating against a myriad of different cis women who fit different versions of womanhood.
Well, and Butler has a great section in the book about a doctor. I think his name was Dr. Money. But there was a gender clinic in the United States that was the 1960s and 70s. And the horrific medical violence done to these people who went through this clinic system, because this doctor was committed to you're either a man or a woman, this hardcore gender dimorphism, right? And so oftentimes his patients, and I'm going to use that in scare quotes, his patients were people who were intersex. And so it was about reaffirming one gender over the other. And often what would happen is outwardly, they would be gender affirming, not gender affirming, but sort of gender conforming rather.
Right.
Whether they would be man, woman, that's it. What often happened is they would have to go through intense medical interventions in order to make them traditionally male or traditionally female.
Yeah.
In the process, it was often, it would destroy their, it would destroy their capacity for pleasure and sex. And it would often destroy their broader overall health in the service of conforming to the male-female binary. And, this is horrific, right? This is what I'm talking about. When we want to sort of arbitrarily force dimorphism onto people instead of recognizing the complexity of sex and gender in human beings, then we are automatically going to be committing forms of medical or social violence on others.
Yep.
It's a consequence of putting people in predetermined boxes and saying, this is how you have to be. As you were mentioning earlier about sex, right? The thing about sex is sex in and of itself is a discursive act as well. Because, for example, when is sex determined? It's often determined by a doctor in a hospital, right? So if you come out and you have a certain type of look about you, they'll just check the box, whether you're male or female, right? Yeah. And so, it doesn't matter that, like you said, some women don't have uteruses or they don't have traditionally like normal, or not normal, but basically like the conforming notions of male and female.
Typical,
right? Like normal scare quotes, typical scare quotes, right? Like and so, for those who are intersex or for those who would later on realize that they weren't comfortable in the skin that they were born in. So, instead of, I don't know, having people be born and not putting their sex on their fucking paperwork, and then over time, just sort of letting them figure that out on their own, which is what most people do, right? And I guarantee you that if you did that, I don't think things would be that different. I think that most folks would probably fall somewhere on the male or female side, whether they were trans or not. And you'd have some folks who would say, fuck that binary, and they would be, non-binary or non-conforming. And that's cool too.
What's the word I heard? Bimodal? I think that's what it was.
Yeah. Bimodal. Yeah. So like some days you're more masc and some days you're more femme. Yeah. And you can kind of bounce back between that. And that's cool too. Like, I love this shit. Like for me, to me, and I promise for our folks listening, I'm trying not to be patronizing. So if I come off that way, I'm sorry. I genuinely think that being a trans person is one of the most beautiful expressions of freedom in human history. Like, period. Like, I think the fact that that a person literally says, I'm not this person, I'm going to be someone else. Yeah. That will make me happy. Yeah. I can't think of something more beautiful and more life affirming than that. And so I'm in awe of their courage and I'm in awe of their determination in spite of the bigotry and the misunderstanding that they face from the problems that they deal with people, even people who, I know, sometimes I fuck up pronouns and I feel really bad about it. Like, I'm not perfect on this. No. I'm working on it. Like, I realize I suck on that. I'm working on it, and it's because it's hard. Like, when you learn a language your entire life a certain way, it's hard to often change that. Yeah. But that doesn't mean I'm not going to. Right. It means I'm fighting in spite of that. And to me, that's what I mean, is that I genuinely believe people living out their real selves, however they are, is what freedom means. Yep. And 100%. Yep. And so if freedom isn't that, then what the hell are we doing? What the fuck does it even mean? What does it matter? Yeah. And so, always be wary of people who talk about freedom out one side of their mouth and on the other side of their mouth, they're talking about limiting freedom. Yeah. Be wary of those people, because these are the people who always talk about how much they love freedom all the time. And yet somehow they always want to pass laws to tell people who they can love and how they can be and how they can live and who they can love and what they can read and what they can watch and what they can learn. Why are these people called the freedom people? No, they're not the freedom people. They're the unfreedom people. They're the tyranny people, And so the anti-gender movement is a movement of tyranny. Yep. It's a movement of, in my opinion, authoritarian control. And as Butler discusses in the book, it's a part of a broader trend around the world of growing authoritarianism, not just in the United States, but also in Europe, especially Eastern Europe, like Viktor Orban's Hungary or Poland, where we're seeing more and more anti-LGBTQ plus, legislation or policy or just even social stigma. These people are on the side of unfreedom. They're on the side of regression and reactionary and reaction. They're not people about freedom. They don't care. They don't give a fuck about freedom.
Yeah.
And Republicans don't give a fuck about freedom. Like conservatives do not give a rat's ass about freedom. What they care about is freedom for you to work and to consume. That's all they care about. And increasingly work, consume, and breed. Those are the only things that they actually want you to have freedom about.
Conformity.
And even then, they don't really want that.
Yep, that's right.
It's all about conforming. It's all about being what they want you to be.
Yep.
And I think that's a big part of why a lot of the political right is so against, is really against LGBTQ plus people, is because it breaks the patriarchy, as you mentioned. It breaks it breaks misogyny, it breaks sexism, it breaks bigotry. But ultimately, it also breaks the traditional notion of what a society should be, in notion of an economy. Mm. The world is going through, in many ways, what's interesting is that for decades, especially in the 1960s and 70s, you had fears of the population bomb. This was the Paul Ehrlich book. They were so afraid. Paul Ehrlich I think he's in his fucking 90s, is this piece of shit biologist who went to India once and saw a bunch of people in the street and freaked the fuck out, and then decided to write a book about how there's too many fucking people in the world because he's a racist asshole. Yep. And which was the population bomb. He basically argued that we should put sterilization stuff in the water so that people wouldn't have kids. Obviously, the China one-child policy, which has been a fucking disaster for that country, right? Where you have two men or 2 or 3 men for every woman in the country. Like it's like that worked out so damn well, right? And so what you see is that. And like with like JD Vance, who's running for vice president, who's like a fucking weirdo who always talks about and Elon Musk is always talking about like having kids, and these pro-natalist people. What there really are is they want compliant workers. Yeah. More and more people are opting to not have kids. My wife and I don't have kids. We will never have kids. First off, it's too fucking expensive. But more importantly, I just don't want kids. Yep. Some people don't want kids, and that's okay. Some people want a lot of kids. That's okay too. There's nothing wrong with any of that. Yeah. The problem is that these people want to form a social control where you get in the traditional, the traditional 2-parent household with kids. Those kids grow up to be workers. Those workers maintain the system for the capitalists. Yeah. That's what they want. They'll never say that out loud, but that's really what it is. It's, they're so afraid of all of this is because, surprisingly, gay people can't have children traditionally, or what is deemed traditional, right? Right. So people who are trans or whoever, they may not have kids in ways that have been traditionally in the past. Yeah, and so
they're anti-abortion, and in many ways they're anti-IVF and anti,
That's right.
Anything other than the traditional standard, whatever they view as the way it needs to be done.
A man and a woman having kids so that they can have kids to have workers, so that the workers can keep working and being exploited for their surplus value, which can then be stolen by the capitalists. That's the real goal. And again, they'll never say that out loud. Every once in a while they will, like depending on who they're talking to, like whatever room they're in. Right. I think JD Vance did it once. But yeah, like that's the real fear, is that there won't be enough workers, like that there won't be enough people to work, which then should ask the better question of, well, why do so many people have to be working so goddamn much? Which is, I think, and that goes into our discussions of degrowth and, sustainable economies and all that. But ultimately it's a real failure of vision, because instead of, changing our mode of production away from exploitation, not just of human beings, but of the fucking planet, that we move to a system based on like human need and human flourishing rather than merely the extraction of surplus value and the accumulation of capital. But they won't interrogate those things, because that would mean interrogating capitalism, which, that's like the be all end all. Because ultimately, I also think deep down that they know, I think they know this too, that like if people learn more and more about, say, LGBTQ plus people and the spectrum of humanity, and if they learn more about like critical race theory, or they will learn more about like anti-racism or whatever, they'll kind of realize most people, once they start going down that path, they may not become hardcore anti-capitalists like you and me, but at the very least, they're going to be people like, this system doesn't fucking work. Yeah. And they're terrified of that. And so a lot of this sort of phantasm of gender, as Butler calls it, I think comes out of a real fear that people are just going to reject the system they live in.
Yeah.
And as they should, because it sucks. Why would no one would ever design this intentionally. And so yeah, I think that we need to fight back against the anti-gender bigots, these people who are so committed to their outmoded notions of what it means to be human.
Yeah.
I think that to be human is to have the capacity to be different, Yep. As Rosa Luxemburg once said, freedom really means the freedom to think differently. And that's right, And so I highly recommend people read the book. There's a lot of really other interesting stuff that they go to in the book. I think it's worth it. And I think that I look forward to reading other books from Judith Butler. I think they are a great scholar, and I learned a lot from their books. So,
right on.
That's Who's Afraid of Gender.
Right on. So we'll go through a couple comments from Vulcan 999. First they said, anytime they claim all trans people are predators, they're projecting.
Oh my God. You want to know something? If I had a kid and I had the choice between putting them in a room with trans people or a room with drag queens or a room of like priests or preachers.
Yeah, the trans people and drag queens every time.
Absolutely. Absolutely. First off, my kids are going to learn a lot more. My hypothetical kid that I don't have because I don't want one, but my hypothetical kid or person that I know.
Yeah.
First off, they're going to learn a lot more and about being human and being kind and maybe learn some makeup tips, like if they go in or some styling tips if they go into the drag queen room. It's total projection. I mean, we hear stories every day of sex abuse by priests against children, or sex abuse against children from fundamentalist pastors.
Yeah.
And it's gross. I mean, there are real divides right now within the Southern Baptist Convention about this, where the Southern Baptist Convention is losing its membership in the United States largely as a result of the majority, the many, many sex scandals that they've had over the years. And that's not just child sex abuse, which is, of course, in my opinion, the worst of it, but also just, serious allegations of sexual abuse or sexual harassment against anybody, including adults, and extramarital affairs that they weren't, and again, like people can have sex with who they want to, but like consenting adults, that's cool. But I mean, don't cheat on your wife, man, especially if you're a preacher and you're preaching that, if you,
that's right. Yeah.
Thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's wife, dude. It's like right in the fucking 10, like you'd think. My kid would be much, much safer in a room not occupied by religion in general, or religious institutions in general. Like, if you want your kid to be abused, take him to church. Sorry. Just statistically, that's the case.
Yeah. Also, it's frustrating that I haven't met a doctor that can look at sex objectively. They always assume, despite how inaccurate they can be.
Oh, right. I mean, and that goes I totally agree with you 100%. And that just goes into my own experience of being a fat person.
Yeah.
So like, there's a lot of anti-fat bias too. They just assume that I'm fat because I'm unhealthy. And they never assume that maybe I have problems and they've made me fat.
Or even which is usually, they're unrelated.
Or they're unrelated, right?
You might have a health issue.
There are all kinds of things. There are other issues that I have that aren't related to me being fat. For example, I have Hashimoto's disorder. It's an autoimmune disorder. My thyroid doesn't work. I have to take thyroid medicine every day. That's genetic. Me being fat had nothing to do with that. You know what I mean? So I have to take that medicine regardless. And so that has led me to have fluctuations in my weight my entire life. Like there have been periods of my life where I was thinner, much thinner than I am now, and periods where I've been heavier. Now, do I always eat the healthiest? By all means, no. But again, there's so much anti-fat discrimination and there's obviously anti-Black discrimination too. That people still have outmoded notions that like Black people have thicker skin or that they feel less pain.
Don't feel as much pain.
It's super,
still really common.
Super fucked up shit. I'm like, how did anybody ever get to that? And it's because ultimately they didn't see Black people or fat people as being fully human. They sort of thought them as being these like weird creatures that are not quite human.
Yeah.
And that's fucked up, right? So all of those things I think go together in just an alphabet soup of awfulness.
And regarding your comment about trans people choosing being beautiful. Velka999 said, it's beautiful because they choose who they are. They are confident to be their true selves.
I mean, to me, it's like, to me, it might be one of the most beautiful expressions of human freedom that exists, period. I mean, I can't, because it's so fundamental. It's so fundamental. Like, you are literally purposefully designing who you will be. And that's something that I find immensely cool and just inspiring. I
don't know if it's as common as in my experience, but I've met many people that have the crossover of being an anarchist and trans. I know anarchist is a political identity. It's not something that's thrust upon you. But trans people, there's a lot of trans anarchists.
Yeah, I think that goes hand in hand very much. So, like, there's a lot of trans atheists, right? Yeah. You're rejecting something and you are actively living for yourself, but not in like a selfish way, but like in a deeply humanistic way where you seek to be the best version of who you want to be and how you interact with others. Like, I don't know. I just find that beautiful. I really do. And I'm in awe of people who do that. And they deserve our respect. They deserve our, and in some ways I think they deserve our adoration because I think they're cool. I just think it's really cool. I'm very inspired by it.
And lastly, gender helps enforce capitalism.
100%, right? So when we think about patriarchy, we think about the heteronormative notion of the family. All of these go hand in hand with the reinforcement of capitalism. And that's why if you look at like most Fortune 500 companies are not led by women.
Right.
They're led by men, right? The United States has never had a woman president, that many countries in the world have never had women leaders, or the United States still has, far more men in its elected offices than it does women, right? Despite the fact that men and women are about half and half, everywhere in the world. So, yeah, I mean, it's also, I also do find it to be sometimes a bit rich when people are like, oh, well, these people, like these countries are being more progressive on these kinds of issues. Well, in some ways they are. For example, Cuba, instituted a new family code a few years ago that was voted on by the public, and it offered broader social and political protections for gay people, for transgender people,
right.
For women in general. It's a really good thing because Cuba did have a history of homophobia. It did have a history of transphobia, but it wasn't like it was. But when people talk about Cuba in bad faith, they always talk about it as if, oh, well, it's so homophobic there or whatever.
Right.
It's not any worse than it would have been in the United States.
Like they like to paint Che Guevara as a homophobe who, and of course he was not great for gay people at the time, but
no.
You got to place it in the context of the world as it was. It wasn't a good place. It wasn't a good place for gay people in general.
No, it wasn't, right? And so when people do that, I find that very much out of bad faith because like the United States was just as bad, if not worse.
Yeah.
And in many ways now, Cuba as a country is much more progressive on this stuff than the United States has ever been.
Yeah.
So, like they were a country that actually reckoned with the legacies of homophobia transphobia and misogyny. And they decided to actually institute a new family code to rectify some of those problems. Outside of the Equality Act that was passed by Congress, which codified marriage equality into law, because Democrats, rightfully so, were afraid that, after the Dobbs decision 2 years ago that banned abortion, that overturned Roe, that they would go after Obergefell next, which was the Supreme Court decision that legalized marriage equality.
Of course they were going to.
Of course they were going to, right? And so they passed the Equality Act like that. And that got done. And that even had some Republican support, which is good.
Yep.
I think the fact that the United States Congress did that quickly is a good thing, right? And they did do it. But again, that's not on the same level as what the Cuba Family Code was. It's very, very different.
Yeah.
And again, we can talk about the legacy of Cuba and criticisms of Castro, and we can do all that. when it comes to policy, when we're talking about this specific policy, Cuba actually reckoned with their past in a way that the United States never has.
Yeah.
And so they're kind of a model, I think, to follow. And they did it right, I think.
Yeah, in some ways they certainly are. Okay, that should be it. What are we covering next time?
So next time we are going to be covering Grace Blakely's new book, Vulture Capitalism.
Interesting.
So I love Grace Blakely. We've talked about her on the show before. We did her book Stolen way, way, way back.
Yep.
So this will be a sequel to that one. I just started reading it today or a couple days ago, and it's great. And I think she's one of the most astute writers going today. She does a really, really good job of explaining, key Marxist ideas in a way that it's relatable and understandable and has a lot of really good anecdotal evidence and good historical evidence for it. So we'll be covering that next time. I'm really excited about talking about it.
Right on. And I guess that just leaves, where can people find you?
So you can find me at justinclark.org. Website's right down there. You can also find me on social media at JustinClarkPH. I'm on Twitter. Not on Twitter. Jesus Christ. I'm on Threads. I'm on Instagram. I'm on Blue Sky. A little bit of TikTok. I'm not as active on TikTok, to be honest. Mainly just because just being on TikTok all the time was not good for my mental health. So I'm just not there all the time. I'm mostly active on Instagram. My recent blog posts on my website have been about short book reviews that I've written outside of the context of read reviews. My latest blog post is a collection of reviews under the title of Politics in the American Empire. So it's a variety of different books related to U.S. imperialism and American politics in general. That's the most recent thing I've worked on. And then I'll be working on a forthcoming piece. It'll be out later in the fall about humanizing technology, a humanist vision of technology. That'll be a lecture I'll be giving later in November, but then I'll also be writing up, and we'll be covering the book also on the show. So later in the fall. So that's what I've been up to. And as I always say, to close this out, please consider becoming a patron at patreon.com/skepticalleftist. Corey Johnston works very, very, very hard. My good friend Corey Johnston works very, very, very hard on this show. He's putting out so many good things, so many good interviews, so many cool things that he's been doing recently. I know that he's been working on putting together a video of your journey from conservative to anarchist. Yep. So that's pretty cool. Please consider becoming a patron. With your Patreon membership, you will get access to the pre-games and post-games of all the shows. So if, an hour to an hour and a half of us doing this show is not enough, please consider becoming a patron.
Listen to us bullshit for another hour after the show.
Exactly. I always try to keep it shorter, but I always keep going longer. I can't help it. But in some ways, what's really cool about doing those is that then Corey's been able to go back and take some of those and make episodes out of them.
That's right.
We've just recently done talking about, the sort of the death of the secular movement from an episode from way back. So definitely become a patron. And we would greatly appreciate your support.
Absolutely. Well, thank you very much, Justin. And thank you, Vilkin999 and Incense Fire Wind, who was also in the chat. And,
thank you so much.
Thank you, everybody. And have a great week or 2 weeks.
All right. We'll see you next time, guys.
All right, folks. That's all for now. Thanks for watching or listening. Remember to share this show with your friends or on the social media site that you use the most. Thank you to everyone who supports this show on Patreon. I really appreciate it, and it helps me keep the power on. Thanks to my top patrons, Damian Marie at Hope, Some Random Geek, Justin Clark, Dan F. Smith, and Lisa Glass. And thank you to my new patrons. You can stay tuned for the list of patrons at the end to see your name listed. If you aren't a patron and want to contribute, you can do that at patreon.com/skepticalleftist, or you can send a one-time donation to buymeacoffee.com/skepticallefty. I also have a Substack where you can subscribe for free or you can donate per month. And lastly, you can get a paid subscription on Spotify that will give you the same access to bonus content and extra long episodes. If you can't contribute financially, then I would like on YouTube or a 5-star rating and a review on Apple Podcasts or one of the podcast review sites like Podchaser would be great. If you want to find more from me, then make sure to check out the show notes for links to all my stuff, or check out my link tree. It's linktr.ee/skepticalleftist. That's where you can find all of my social media spaces and communities. You can also email me at mindofaskepticalleftist@gmail.com. Thanks so much for listening or watching. Make sure to leave a comment on the video, join your local org, print off some posters or pamphlets, and spread the propaganda. Also, stick around for a clip from this episode's post-show chat. Right.
You know?
Yeah.
I think sometimes
clearly not, right?
Yeah. And I know, like, as a world, like, I know deep down that a lot of times we buy something because we feel bad and we want to feel better. It's like a little dopamine hit. I get that, right? And we all do that. We all do that from time to time, and that's fine. But I just see this like glorification of consumption that I find so unnerving on TikTok.
Yeah. It's unboxing video.
So the political result of Ayn Rand is neoliberalism, is the destruction of the public, the destruction of the commons, and the destruction of the social structure, like the social fabric of the country, where everybody's just like this selfish individual. So I think her influence is largely pernicious. I don't think there's anything positive about it. And I'm glad she's dead. She's been dead for 42 years, and I hope and I'm glad that she'll be dead for another 1,000 or 1,000,000 years after